acknowledge that, look, when we were in the trenches during, the deep, dark periods of apartheid, we did speak perhaps with a more common tongue, and we have turned around and we have betrayed that. What the GNU needs to first do is develop a somewhat coherent and unified position on land.
Dumelang, molweni, abshen, sanbonani, nda tobela, realocha. Hello from wherever you're watching us. Welcome to uMhlaba Talks, a podcast brought to you by the Land and Accountability Research Center at the University of Cape Town. My name is Tiane Doda, ufaka unyawo zothathu ndayeni uhlamba ngobubende amaze khona. Today we bring you another episode of uMhlaba Talks, and of course I'm not alone. I'm with my co-host, whose voice is always changing. So let's hear today's voice. Hello, uMhlaba. Say hi to the viewers.
Hello, everybody. uMhlaba here. Dumelang. Hope you're all feeling great today and energized for today's very interesting topic about land.
Yes. So we continue on the theme of land today, as uMhlaba has already implied. Today's topic is going to be focusing on land reform now. We're going to be assessing where we're at, what is coming out of Parliament in the form of legislation, what is coming out of the courts in the form of judgments, and what are people's experiences on the ground, and where do all these meet, so that we can get a clear picture of where we're at in terms of land reform. To help us discuss that, we are here, we have a guest, an amazing guest, Nolundi Luwaya, the director of LAC, our director actually. Say hi to the people, Nolundi.
Hi, Tiane. Hello, uMhlaba. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Great. This is so strange and weird, but we're here.
It's fine. Just
Sitting in a different arrangement.
Absolutely.
But anyway, let me quickly introduce you to the viewers. Nolundi Luwaya is a director of LAC, as I've already mentioned. Nolundi's research interests include rural women's land rights under customary law and methods for understanding and protecting these rights that are informed by experiences of rural women. She's also interested in questions of legal pluralism and the challenges involved in teaching law in a plural system, such as we have in South Africa. So that's Nolundi, that's our guest. But before we get into the conversation, we're going to play a small game just to get us into the space and settle us and settle our energies. So I'm going to hand over to uMhlaba to run the game. Hopefully I'm going to win. You're going to make me win, right? What's the prize? What are we getting today?
Just happiness. Okay, that's all.
I've been so happy. Like I've been winning this happiness. Can the price change?
No, we just want to make sure that you spread it all over,
Okay, over to you, uMhlaba. It's your game.
Okay, so Nolundi, the name of the game is called How Well Do You Know Your Land? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds and I'll be giving you 4 questions.
Okay.
When there is a tie between you and Tiane, then I'll have an additional question.
Okay.
Sure? Are you ready?
Got it. I'm ready.
Okay. There are 10 former territories that the apartheid government designated as homelands, or what we know as Bantustans. Name 5.
Leboa, Transkei, Ciskei, KwaZulu, Bophuthatswana.
Awesome. Next question. Tiane, are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Name the 3 pillars of land reform in South Africa.
Prosecution, redistribution, and tenure security.
Tenure?
Reform.
Yeah.
No,
well, I'll give it to you. So it's 2 for you. What is a South African national park that is bordered by the provinces of Limpopo and Mpumalanga, as well as the countries
That's getting the easiest question.
Zimbabwe and Mozambique? The park is one of the largest game reserves in Africa.
Kruger National Park?
Awesome. A point goes to you.
Easy questions. Again, this is unfair.
If it's easy, then you should get it right.
No, for Nolundi, not for me.
Okay. So let me ask the fourth question. The language spoken by the inhabitants of Wakanda in the Black Panther movies is a real language, an official language of South Africa and Zimbabwe. It's tonal language, meaning that the pitch of the words affect its meaning. What is this language?
It's close.
Awesome. So we have a tie. It's
Okay.
2 for yeah. So our tiebreaker question. What is the Southern Bantu language that is an official language in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and a nearby country whose name also include the name of the language?
It's
Deben.
Ndebele.
No,
Siswati.
no.
Oh.
Huh?
Shona?
Okay, let me give you a clue.
Huh?
Right? Its name is the name of a nearby country.
Oh,
whose-
Oh,
Sesotho.
Siswati.
Setswana.
Okay, so to give one to
I want to
Tiane,
win.
it's Sesotho.
Almost jumped
Okay.
out.
Okay,
Sesotho.
well done. Well
So,
done.
Kombucha is
It got
gone.
intense. It got intense. It's fine.
well done to you, Tiane.
Thank
I'm
you.
really impressed that you won this time.
There's happiness again.
Yes. So go ahead
I'm
and
very
spread it.
happy.
Sure.
So, okay, thank you, uMhlaba, and I'm glad I've won. Sorry, Nolundi.
Fine, I'll survive.
But let's get into the conversation. Um, Maybe to start with, just broadly, because in previous episodes, sijonge land dispossession, the history of it, and we looked at it from a spiritual perspective. We looked at it from the Khoi and San history, looked at it from the farm context, and also we looked at it the last episode. Now I forgot what we touched on. It's gone, but basically we looked at it from very different perspectives. So now we would like to know. Oh, and also in the last two previous episodes, we spoke to activists from rural areas who are currently facing and fighting and resisting land dispossession.
Right.
So, against that background, we'd like to find out from your perspective or from your research, where are we in South Africa now in relation to, in terms of land reform?
Sure. The short answer is that we're stuck.
Mm.
The slightly longer version of that answer is that all three of the programs that are designed to work collectively to advance land reform are facing serious challenges and serious shortcomings. So, as you identified in the quiz, the three projects are obviously the restitution arm, the redistribution arm, and the tenure reform arm. As we know, each one of these has embarked on trying to advance land reform holistically.
Yeah.
The challenge is that they've each really struggled to do that. So, with restitution, we know that there are vast numbers of claims that have not yet been settled. We know that people who lodged restitution claims in that early period of our democracy, between 94 and 98, still await the resolution of some of those claims.
Yeah.
We know that obviously large collectives of people were also left out of the restitution process. It closed before that they could lodge their claims. So we know that restitution has had very uneven success. There have been, massive kind of policy errors in terms of how the state has sought to pursue restitution. And at this point, we are still sitting with an incredible backlog of claims. Numbers are, estimating that it would take over 100 years to resolve the
Sure.
claims that are in the system already. Never mind people who haven't yet lodged and haven't had a chance. We know that redistribution has also been tackled in a particular way from a policy perspective, and the focus has really kind of resided around agricultural advancement and trying to bring in Black farmers into what has been a traditionally white commercial farming space.
Mm.
Again, that's had uneven success. The projects have kind of pursued an angle that tries to partner upcoming Black farmers with established white farmers. That also, is dependent then on the spirit and the willingness of the kind of mentor partner.
Or the recap program.
Correct,
Mm,
correct. And then we also, with tenure reform, are sitting with a variety of pieces of law that have been written with the purpose of securing tenure in different contexts. So, for example, with farm workers, you've got ESTA, the extension of the Security of Tenure Act, which tries to prevent the unlawful eviction of farm workers.
mm, mm,
You've got IPILRA, which I'm sure has come up in the podcast before, the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act, which secures the rights of people whose rights are termed informal. I won't go through the whole list, but the
mm,
point
mm,
is for the tenure reform element, you've got a lot of legislation, but we know that the struggle in South Africa is that there's always the implementation gap between what's law on paper and the lives of people on the ground.
oh, I mean, from what you're saying, what I'm getting is from the previous episodes, we can see that land dispossession is still ongoing. But on the other hand, the reform, which is basically actually returning the land to the people from whom it was taken, is it's not happening, or it's not happening fast enough. I mean, we've touched on some of the reasons, but if you can crystallize it into in simple terms, like to make it understandable to a primary school kid,
Sure.
what's causing the delay? What's causing the yeah? What's delaying things? What is stopping things?
Sure. So I think the struggle in the South African context can probably be simplified to 2 points, right? The first is that the scale of land dispossession, the ways in which it happened, which you have unpacked in the podcast, was such that it was so invidious. It spread over such a long period of time from the colonial era into the apartheid era, became so entrenched that to actually undo those patterns of dispossession is to some degree a mammoth task, right? So we're not just talking about a small section of the country where people were dispossessed. We're talking about the entire country. We're talking about, loss of land, but we're also talking about the impact of loss of land on the lives of people and how it changed their lives. So I'm sure you guys have discussed things like, land disposition, prompting and resulting in migrant labor patterns,
Mm-hmm.
people leaving their homes to
Mm,
come to urban
mm,
centers. So all of those things are the knock-on effects of the kind of original sin, if you will, of land dispossession. So what you're actually trying to unravel isn't just a single component. You're trying to unravel the root cause of multiple issues, if you will,
mm,
right? You're
mm,
trying to kind of use this one lens and try to solve that one element, but actually the knock-on effects of what happened in that original land disposition process makes that very complicated. The second element that I would say in the kind of simplified response that's got us stuck has been political will.
mm.
Right? Whether that takes the form of the types of laws we have, whether it takes the form of the state's willingness,
Yeah.
but it's this kind of all encompassing idea that actually the power to effect land reform in its broad meaning vests ultimately in the state, right? And that's largely because of the nature of land relations in our country and the fact that the state is, nominal owner of large swaths of land, and it's within their power
Mm,
to effect the redress. The ways in which the state has sought to do that have proven to be either quite narrowly conceived, so a large role has been given to law, or they've been slightly misdirected. So, for example, there was a period where the state really adamantly stuck to this idea of willing buyer, willing
yeah.
seller for the restitution process, that you could not get the land unless you had someone who was willing to sell the land to the state. The state then would purchase it, and that land then would be fed into the restitution program. Now, the willing buyer concept relies on the people who have land, right?
Mm,
And
mm,
they have to
mm,
be willing to sell it. And so that can hamper the process. So you're kind of sitting with this sum, if you will, of a complicated program and a
mm.
complicated problem and solutions that have not kind of run the full extent of thinking sensitively
Yeah,
and thinking creatively.
sure. Wow. I mean, from what you're saying, it seems as though you're saying a lot of the problems that we see in society, and especially in relation to Black people or people who were dispossessed of land in the past, are actually linked to land. because you're talking about like the knock-on effect of land dispossession, the displacement, and so on, which has implications for the family and where people are and how people live. Um, and also, I mean, the land question is such an important question, and when you think about it, it's been 30 years since 1994. And from what you're saying in relation to the point about a lack of political will, why do you think there is that? Why do you think there's a lack of political will for such an essential um, element of our democracy and of our country? It's actually defining, the land disposition, as we're saying, is like has defined the shape of our country and how, yeah, and how people live. So why has this question been neglected, if I can put it in those terms?
I think in part because it is complicated and it
Mm,
is actually a difficult task to undertake, and to undertake it in ways that have um, a meaningful impact on the lives of people most directly affected by dispossession. So I do think it is a complex problem.
okay.
I also think that our state and the kind of lack of political will is partly because I'm not sure that there is much. That there's been much consideration given to just how deep the wound of dispossession actually
Yeah.
is, right? And so I think that the way in which, for example, particularly ahead of like an election year, the land issue is kind of used as, a thing to garner votes. So in the election before this year's election, there was a whole kind of conversation and uproar about expropriation without compensation.
Yeah.
And it was kind of used as a populist tool to kind of garner support and votes. And I must admit that for me, if you're willing to use what is effectively a national wound
Mm,
as almost kind of a cheap tool to bring and rally support, I think it says quite a lot about how you think about that national wound, and how you actually think about these questions of solving it. And so I think that, yeah, the political will is partly influenced by the complexity of it, but it also feels like there is, dare I say, a kind of a disregard for
mm.
just how huge that wound is in our country.
Oh. But I mean, to me, it feels like there's something else. I
Mm,
don't know. Maybe I'm just too suspicious. It
mm,
feels like there's something else because the people who are in government, who are in parliament, these are people who come from these communities, from the histories of fighting the struggle, and who come from communities that were dispossessed of land. So they know the impact of land
mm.
dispossession. So I'm struggling to reconcile that history and where they come from, and them not caring enough to see this question resolved. Yes, I get the complexity of it,
Sure.
but then I think the question around political will and the disregard, where does the disregard come from? Because these are the people who are fighting for land, pre 94, who got us to 94. So what do you think happened to them after 94?
So I think partly the disregard comes from the fact that although this is an incredibly harmful crime, if you will, it's an
Yeah.
incredibly
Mm,
harmful violation of people's rights. I think that people in power view it as survivable, that actually people are surviving. If you can call the life of, a South African who has a history of dispossession in their family, who hasn't been fortunate enough to secure employment, doesn't have, adequate living conditions, if you can call that survival,
mm,
that there is a sense that, like, well, people are, making it. Fine, the quality of that survival is horrendous, I'm even loath to kind of call it survival, but there's this sense, I think, that, well, we're kind of managing and, people are kind of getting over it, if you will. I also think that we don't talk about these questions holistically,
mm.
right? We kind of pull them apart and we don't directly draw the link that actually at the heart of a lot of the experience of Black South Africans is dispossession,
Mm,
and are the kind of knock-on impacts of that. So we pull it apart as in, like, it's the inadequate health system, it's, a question of access to justice, it's about poverty being related to the high unemployment rate. But we're not talking about these things by steeping them in the root,
mm.
steeping them in the heart of it. And then, of course, there is the commitment to the kind of harmonious aspects of the democratic project, right? The sort of the fact that
Rainbow
one,
Nation.
exactly, and how much, or how many stones can you throw at that kind of facade, if you will, when you kind of have said, well, I'm stepping up to lead this country that, adheres to this facade. And I think it becomes difficult then to throw stones because you're also trying to maintain the image, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Flava, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I do have like a lot of questions, but
Okay, we will take one for now.
okay, yes, let's
Please.
take one for now. Thank you, Nolundi, for giving us that, holistic view of what is currently happening and the complexity of the land reform program in South Africa. But I wanted to know more about the work that you are actually doing at LAC, right? Are you focused on all the three pillars of the land reform program, or how
Sure.
does it? Yeah.
Sure. That's a great question. So LARC certainly doesn't claim to be focused on all three pillars of the land reform project. The work that we already do is more than we can manage. I think that to work across all three would be difficult.
Mm.
So let me tell you about what we do. LARC's work is kind of divided into three thematic areas, if you will. So we do work around land rights, work around what we call traditional governance, which relates to traditional systems of leadership and questions of democratic governance. We also then do work with mining affected communities. What sort of sets our work apart is that we focus specifically on communities that are termed the former homeland communities. And these are often communities and groupings who live under systems of customary laws. So people who follow indigenous ways of governing themselves, structuring their lives. And so the work that we seek to do is we're obviously a research unit, as our name says. And what we try to contribute is kind of, evidence led, people led research that we then use across kind of three strategic tools, if you will. Research kind of for its own purposes, litigation and mobilization. And we kind of work across those and we feed our research into those, litigation and mobilization specifically. And really what we're trying to do is just to put into the conversation and to support the struggles of people who live in those former homeland areas, whose struggles always, for most of the communities, are deeply related to and circle back to this question of land and land dispossession. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Mm, Thank you, Flava, for that
Sure.
question. I mean, from what you said earlier and what you just shared right now, I think there's an interesting link that I would like to get into, because you said land disposition has deeper impacts, and from my reading or my analysis, I would think that actually land disposition also has led to dispossession of personhood for Black people. So in the former homelands or in rural areas, what are you seeing? What is the situation? You've sort of touched on it already, that it's sort of, related to what you were talking about earlier about land dispossession, but if you can give us a snapshot of what is the situation there.
So certainly in the areas in which we've worked, I think there are three enduring experiences, and I'm not trying to reduce everybody's
Of course, yeah.
experience into one, but there are three kind of familiar strands, if you will, right? The one is, I think, the kind of familiar narrative that we know of how badly our state is doing in resourcing those areas. So I'm talking here about things like the kind of group of socioeconomic rights, the basics, right? Access to health, access to quality education, access to water, access to electricity. And that is an enduring part of how people are living in the former homeland areas. We've been to places where if you're wanting to use a hall for a workshop, that hall doesn't have its own electricity supply. What you have to do is draw an extension cable from the home of somebody who, we then put electricity in their electricity box and we use it that way. And so the kind of enduring theme or the strand, the common thing is that experiences there are difficult. And I don't say that lightly, I don't say it as like a kind of a casual comment, but the reality is that the basics are not being met in many of those areas. The second familiar strand is that people are making a way, even though the state has, in many ways, either handed over its role to traditional leadership and in some cases almost left them at the mercy of traditional leaders. Again, not painting them all with the same brush, but we
mm.
have encountered instances where people are left at the mercy of a leader who isn't operating in their best interests. And so these questions about what actual democratic governance looks like in these communities and whether or not people are experiencing fully South African citizenship, this experience of being protected by the Constitution, this experience of being paid attention to by, the political leaders that you vote into power, that entire kind of basket of these questions of the
Sure.
actual reality of what it is to live in a democratic country is a second kind of familiar thread. And then the third, I think, Tiana, is just an incredible an endurance, an endurance that I admire deeply. And I think it would have come across in the podcast episodes with the two activist colleagues, Usisnotle no Mavuso. But just this absolute determination, this enduring quiet confidence, almost, if you will, that this is not what they fought for. This is not the South Africa that they believe South Africa should be. And people's determination to do what they can to assert their rights, to assert their right to their livelihoods, their ways of life, their cultural practices, despite really challenging situations. And, I'm sure both Sisnotle and Ubamavuso have spoken far more eloquently and with a far deeper experience than I have about what those challenges look like. But we're talking about, challenges to your actual safety, your life. And so I think for me, those three threads kind of crop up as common across our experiences in rural spaces.
Um, Sorry, excuse my sighs and shocks, because it's just every time, you get into these conversations and when you actually really listen to them, it's always shocking,
Mm.
And also today, as we are speaking about the state's positionality and movements and what is happening in rural areas, it's like they are at two extreme ends.
Mm.
Because earlier we talked about how there seems to be a lack of political will to drive and fulfill and realize land reform. And then now you just mentioned that in these areas where people are actually struggling and neglected, there's this endurance where people are continuing to fight for for a better South Africa, for the dream to be realized. So it's really a struggle to reconcile the two, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I guess the question I have in mind is, what do you think needs to happen for the two to be reconciled, or for to get
Mm.
government to do
Mm.
something
I
so
hear you.
that South African citizens
Mm.
everywhere actually can see the South Africa they dream of, where everyone actually benefits.
So I think a deep part of it for me is that I think there needs to be an acknowledgement of the betrayal, because what comes up for me as you're kind of describing the kind of gap or the ways in which the positionality of people in rural communities is so starkly different to that of the state, the word that keeps kind of surfacing for me is betrayal. I
Mm.
think that what we're seeing is what it looks like when people betray the very people that they fought for, the very people, who are part of the communities from which they themselves emerge. Um, it's a yeah. There's been a ripping of a fabric of trust. There's been a betrayal of promises. There's been a betrayal almost of who you are to a degree.
Mm.
And I think that it would make a real impact for the state, for the players in power, to turn around and acknowledge that, look, when we were in the trenches during, the deep, dark periods of apartheid, we did speak perhaps with a more common tongue, and we have turned around and we have betrayed that. We have, to a degree, gone back on those,
Mm.
promises, on those thoughts, theories, dreams, aspiration of what a different South Africa could look like. And I think that what we continue to see is just the deeper entrenchment of that betrayal. And that entrenches then the absolute
Sorry.
kind of division in positionality. So, what needs to happen? It feels like step 1A is that the state needs to turn around, humble itself, and say to people, we have messed up here. We have, to a degree, left you to flounder for yourselves. I then think that we need to think creatively about a strategy going forward. So we do have some laws that have real potential, but we have to acknowledge that the system and the way that we've set it up currently will always exclude some people, right? Law, by its very nature, excludes people. Every single one of the pieces of legislation that I've spoken about set out characters and parameters for who is protected, right? The Restitution Act sets out parameters for who can qualify to be a beneficiary. So, by its nature, there is an element of law that will always leave some out. And the question becomes what happens to those who are left out. And I'm curious about whether we should be thinking about supplementary mechanisms to hold the more kind of law directed parts of the land reform program, but something else. Do we need to have members of the government, people in power, traveling from small dusty village to small dusty village, literally just sitting under trees in someone's backyard, listening, just listening and hearing what people want you to hear, what they want to talk about? Do we need some kind of large systematic program of the recordal of oral land histories? Something that says to people, look, I know that based on the criteria of Act XYZ, you won't fit into program Y. But what we can do is that we can take your experience and we can put it somewhere. We can feed it into the archive of the history of our country. And this has happened to some degree, right? In kind of in a variety of projects. I think about something like the work of the Surplus Peoples Project in recording kind of the devastation of forced removals, right? But I am curious about how else one can begin to try to heal this national wound outside of the restrictive measures presented by the law. And I am just curious about whether that could begin to soothe some of the hurt. So I'll leave it there at those two steps. I think there's a lot more, but but those for me feel like urgent and somewhat doable steps.
And also, I think to address the question of the betrayal, I think we need to be more brave in speaking the truth as South Africans, especially Black South Africans and people who were dispossessed of the land. Like, we need to be brave, because I feel like sometimes we speak around what we really want to say, and I think that's part of the reason why we sort of like not getting forward with this. Because I really like what you said about like how the people in government and it's been 30 years. They've been in government for 30 years. That's not a short time of period.
Very long time.
We're in the trenches with people in rural areas, and now they left them in those trenches. And in fact, I like the term you use, they entrenched the inequalities, meaning that actually instead of pulling people out of those trenches, they just dug the trenches even deeper. So there's something very sinister about that, and that's what I can't put my finger on as to what drives that. What would make someone that was your comrade do that to you, turn around and do that to you, and pretend not to see your pain, not to see your reality, not to relate to your pain, and pretend that things are fine when they are not fine. And for me, I don't know, I would love to hear your view on this. For me, that speaks to the question of who is considered human. Because the people that we're talking about really, because in South Africa, we're too scared of talking about race. Actually, we're talking about Black people. These are Black people that are in the former homelands who have been struggling since apartheid, since colonialism, and they are still struggling even under democracy. So is it because really they still considered as not human enough? And then that's why, there's this sense that it's like, oh no, they'll survive, or it doesn't matter.
So I think what comes up for me is that there is something about the South African success story that requires Black people to self-harm, to almost maim yourself, right? So in order to be considered successful in whatever form that looks, but let's take kind of a very simplified definition of that, right? As living somewhere where you've got a steady supply of running water, your home is made of bricks, you are able to walk around with relative security, you've got stable electricity, although, not much of the country has that. Somewhere where you're employed, you have a car, you've had a level of education up to tertiary, right? So some of the kind of basics of a successful South African. There is something about achieving that and meeting that requires a form of self-maiming, because it requires you to remove yourself from other things and other people who look like you, sound like you, speak like you, are of you, right? So to live somewhere where you have relative safety, stable electricity, stable water, a brick and mortar home, you are moving away from somewhere, right? You're moving away from either the informal settlement area, or you're moving away from ilali apho bukhulele khona, but okusalayo uyahamba uya kwenye indawo. And that geographical difference, which we know is related back to what? The land question, right? Is the first self-harm. You physically remove yourself, you leave your family home at Alexandra, and you move to Ekapa, to the suburbs of Rondebosch. Yeah. So one, there is a kind of a harming there. There is a removal of yourself. Then you need to move in the world in a different way, right? And that obviously first is triggered by language. Immediately, you need to be able to navigate the world and the spaces of the English language in the English language's way, right?
Yeah.
The better you can command that, the more successful you will be. So immediately you're pulling yourself away from isintu, elalwimi lakokwenu, your native, right?
Yeah.
So another self-harming, a pulling away. And then so it goes, right? Then you seek employment. You seek employment in what? A capitalist space, one, which has a particular definition of success and advancement and seniority and etc., which immediately pulls you away from perhaps a space where life was more about a shared range of assets. Life was more about, collectively kind of advancing everyone. And I'm not kind of trying to paint rosy pictures of, harmony and kumbaya, but I am saying that there is something different about the essence of the life you need to lead in order to be considered successful. And I'm circling then the long way around, sorry.
Take your time. I'm liking it.
Back to your point about who is considered human. And so what happens to a Black South African like myself, right, is that to be considered completely human in the eyes of the law, the politics, the kind of social standing, I need to remove myself from another definition of human. So it's almost like we have two categories of human. We have the category of human who is meeting the kind of standards of success, right? And then we have the category of human who is, I would argue, perhaps more authentic, but completely invisibilized and disregarded. And what you're doing is you're almost kind of pulling yourself away from that. I almost want to say like that root, langhambo, that more authentic version of yourself, to contort yourself into something else because you're trying to qualify to be human in the eyes of the main system, so that you're seen as successful and etc. So it is about humanness, but it's also about the violences that you're required to almost commit against yourself and against others to qualify to be this other kind of human. I hope this is not getting too like
No. It's
metaphysical or philosophical.
We're there. You are home. This is what we do here. We go all the way. We are not in class. We're not in a workshop. So this is the space for that. And actually, those are the narratives that are often left out in court papers because they are structured in a certain way. You have to, draft them in a particular way. They are left out in lecture halls because you have to present material in a particular way. Left out of conversations in seminars, in workshops. So really, this platform has opened up space for us to explore the expansive understanding of what is happening and has happened in South Africa to people who were dispossessed of land. So that explanation is very fitting. It's welcome. UMhlaba.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting and actually mind-blowing. But I'm still stuck on the betrayal and the element of law. I mean, South Africa is praised for its constitution. So I'm curious to know what what's the legislation's role in protecting the land rights of the people in the former Bantustans? I know that you've touched on a few legislations, Pilra and others. Maybe we could go on deep to discuss those.
Sure. So, look, I think the law does have a role to play, right? I know I might be sounding quite disparaging of it. I think the law has a role to play because it has the ability, one would hope, to protect the most vulnerable from the very worst forms of violation. Yeah. So the law shouldn't leave you where you have to rely on hoping, gosh, I hope this is a good leader that we have. Gosh, I hope this is a good
Yeah.
president that we have. Gosh, I hope I get lucky and we have a good, whatever, I don't know, judge or something. You should be in a position where there is a base level of protection provided by the law for those who are in the most vulnerable position. Now, I think that our laws can get us there, but we need to also make sure that we're putting people in a position where they're not always having to be protected, but that they themselves are able to protect themselves quite actively. So it's not a completely passive relationship. So to kind of go deeper on the role of the law, I think that laws like IPILRA, laws like ESTA, laws like the prevention of the illegal eviction of unlawful occupiers, and a range of other laws were intended to do that, right? And they were intended to provide these kind of base protections and broadly conceived definitions, right? So if you take something like the the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act, it has a really broad definition of informal land rights, yeah, which opens up space for protection, yeah. What we're starting to see now, particularly for some of the laws around things like traditional governance and some of the laws that are specifically aimed at former homeland communities, you're seeing a bit of a narrowing of space. That actually what you're seeing is if you don't fit this particular definition, it's a little bit more difficult for you to be protected by the law. It's a little bit more difficult for you to kind of find a base protection. You're also seeing that there's a shift in how the concepts of things like accountability, things like, democratic practice, how that's being interpreted. And what kind of comes up in the LARC work a lot, because we are focused on customary law, is how that narrowing of space, how that somewhat distorted conception of accountability really rubs up against customary law, and what customary law makes possible from an accountability, a kind of a more democratic, people-centered, people-led ethos, ethic, right? And so you're trying to cast a system with a very different ethos, a very different kind of center of being in the customary law system. You're trying to hold it and structure it and legislate it, I guess, in the tools of a system that emerges from a very different background, that being the common law system, right? And kind of thinking about legislation as a more familiar tool for the common law than it is for customary law. And what that misfit does, what it looks like to try and sort of force customary law to contort in that way. And so part of what I think are the shortcomings of some of the legislation is that they don't give enough thought to the impact of that kind of legislation as a tool on customary law communities. And so there are a select few, like IPILRA, that have thought about that, that have been drafted in a way that is about opening up space, right? So IPILRA allows for space for community practice, whatever that might be. But we've shifted in how we're drafting legislation to something that's less nuanced, less considerate of the ethic and ethos of a customary law system. I think I might have lost the thread of your question a bit there. Sorry.
No, it's you've actually like answered me, but I wanted to know more in how do those legislations um protect the land rights of those in the former
Sure.
Bantustan.
Sure. So let's take the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act, because it is the one that offers the broadest level of protection
Yes.
to land rights holders under systems of customary law. Basically, under IPILRA, the definition of informal land rights is broad enough to include land rights that are held under systems of customary law. IPILRA makes it very clear that a person who holds such informal land rights may not be deprived of their land rights, so those can't be taken from them without their consent, right? And this has proven to be probably one of the most I don't want to say effective, but perhaps one of the most important protections for rural communities in the former homelands, particularly in the context of something like mining. And again, I'm sure that both Reverend Mavuso and Sis Nontle spoke at length about this. But the kind of key thing is that this is a piece of law that does a rare thing, which is that it places in the hands of the rights holders the power to actively protect their rights by giving or withholding their consent. And there's been, two kind of most cited, perhaps, pieces of work from the court, judgments from the court that underscore this, right? So you had the Baleni judgment, which deals with the community of Ekolobeni, which is where Sis Nontle comes from. And in that judgment, it was made very clear that when it comes to considering which between the standard of consultation, which is required under the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act, the MPRDA, it requires consultation. IPILRA requires consent. And the question was between those two, which is the standard that is required? Baleni makes it very clear that the standard is consent. It's consent, right? People must consent. Under the case of Maledu in the Constitutional Court, the court made clear that the MPRDA does not trump IPILRA, right? That the two acts must be read together in a way that facilitates the operation of both. And so what you're seeing here is the court reaffirming the position of IPILRA as a protective element. And so it, as I say, it for communities in the former homelands, it plays a vital role because that linchpin, that point of consent, is a key protection. Of course, there are questions about what is consent, what standard of consent, how do you get consent. But at the very least, what we're seeing here and what I think I'm trying to point out is that this is a piece of legislation that does what I would think is quite a rare piece of work of placing some power in the hands of the informal land rights holders.
So a portion of me, uMhlaba, in Mokopane, where there is mining activity going on and a community gets relocated elsewhere, can that community use IPILRA to say, look, we didn't want this to move, we want our land back? How does it work? Like how does one use that piece of legislation, actively to protect themselves or their community?
So, look, the use of IPILRA, I think, differs from context to context. For the most part, it is probably a more effective shield, right? And the timing at which it can be the most effective shield is probably further forward in the process. So, where we've seen some of the most effective use of the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act is where people are right at the beginning, where it's still at the point of conversations, the mining company or your traditional leader or the state, whomever, is saying you're going to have to be relocated. At that point, asserting the IPILRA right to not be deprived without your consent has proven to be most effective. That's not to say that it can't be raised after the fact, but it probably would be more challenging because, the kind of the relocation itself has already occurred. And there are questions then about what has happened to the land from which you were moved. So it's not impossible to, after the fact, say we never consented to this deprivation. I would just wonder how possible it would be for that relocation to be reversed. I'm not saying it can't be, but I do think IPILRA is probably a more effective shield at the front end, if you will, of these processes.
Awesome.
Thank you, uMhlaba, for that practical question. I sometimes get lost in the metaphysical. But I mean, in relation to uMhlaba's question, do people actually have access to IPILRA? Is it readily available? Can, like, the average rural citizen be able to just access it and understand it and use it? And because, I mean, we've been talking a lot about laws, but then these are Eurocentric laws that we're talking about. There's also customary law, which you touched on earlier. So in relation to this question, so the one question is about accessibility to IPILRA in particular and other laws. But what protections does customary law offer? So I'm asking you two questions, sorry.
Sure. So let me start with the access question around IPILRA. This is probably the greatest shortcoming, certainly of this law, but I would argue of perhaps all law and many laws, right? Is how readily available is knowledge about this particular law. And I would say for Ipilra, it's not that readily available. We, as LARC, see often that people don't know that their land rights are protected in this way under Ipilra. It's probably one of the things that our state doesn't do effectively, is spread knowledge about what your rights are, how they are encapsulated and reflected in the law, what protections are available to you in the law. But then, of course, the actual practice of enforcing an appeal right
Yep.
requires particular types of resources, right? It requires somebody who can translate your experience into that language of the law, identify that this is a situation that meets the standards of IPILRA, and therefore, you know, kind of structure that case. And that means lawyers, it means, you know, the kind of resources and finances that go into that entire process. So this question of accessibility is a big one. It's an absolute big one. And again, points very much at what sits in that gap between the law on paper and what people are actually experiencing.
Practice.
Then coming to this question about customary law and what protections does it provide. So at LARC, we really assert that customary land rights are strong rights. They are at the same level or akin to ownership rights, and that it is clear in customary systems and systems of holding your land, you know, under kind of indigenous legal systems, that people have very strong and well protected rights to their homestead, you know, to their household, and that there are ways within the system to secure that. So, for example, you know, notions of social tenure, the fact that people who live elalini now are able to identify ba no elakaya kusala
Yeah.
obani and they've always lived there, and you know that is a form of security because nobody would really easily move into that home. And someone would say, no, nangona kungekho mntu ikhaya livaliwe basekapa or whatever, but that is the homestead of this family. Exactly.
You can't just.
Exactly. So that's one mechanism. It's kind of these built-in notions of social tenure that exist within these customary systems. The other is that the processes of land allocation differ for sure, you know, around the country. But ultimately, within the kind of customary system, processes of land allocation don't just happen with you going to an office and getting a piece of paper. They involve levels of decision making, they involve levels of authority. Some processes involve the neighbors coming together. Some processes involve, you know, whoever the kind of senior figure of authority might be in that area, whether it's a headman, whether it's, you know, some of the kind of traditional leader, kind of in consultation with people saying, okay, can we give these people the site or this is where they're going to live? So there is a way in which the process of land allocation happens that, again, is not just individualized. It's not just signing papers at an office or between two individuals. I sell you my home, you buy my home. There is something collective about it. There is an accountability there that's built into how it's witnessed and how it plays out in the sight of other people, right? And so again, I would argue that that system affords some kind of protection, right? That if there are threats, there are kind of witnesses, there are people that you can draw on and say, "Hayibo, but when I walk on, and that builds in a level of protection. I think that within customary systems as well, you know, there's a very kind of common error that's made where people think about customary land and customary land rights, that everything is communal, right? It's all held collectively. And that isn't actually the case. That, you know, it's clear that there are parts of it that one can have strong individual rights to, and then there are, of course, shared resources, whether that's grazing land, whether it's forestry, whether it's, you know, access to the sea, to draw on kind of marine livelihoods. So there are different forms of rights within that system. And then lastly, I would say that there's a versatility in use, right? So if the community can see actually sidinga ezinye iziza apha, abantu bayanda, imizi yanda, abantwana bayakhula, we might need to then encroach on this grazing area. Sisike apha sithi hayi ngoku siyayijika lena yekile uba you know, lidlelo sizosika iziza apha, if that's appropriate. So there's a flexibility in use within that system that also allows people to make choices about how they want to grow their community, how they want to take decisions about collective resources. And so I think that within the system itself, there are protections that are built in. The challenge comes in always having to translate that system and those kind of securities and built-in rights into the language of the law, right? And
Mm.
the law, I say it like that because
Yeah.
I'm talking about Western conceptions of it, and what happens in that translation
Mhm.
exercise.
Mm. 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 I mean, this sounds really amazing. And if I heard you correctly, you seem to be saying IPIRA, the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights, is just about the only piece of legislation that actually has space that recognizes that system.
Yes, so IPILRA is a very short piece of law,
Mm.
actually. And Section 2 is the key section that kind of sets out, protections. And in Section 2(4), if I'm not mistaken, it speaks about custom and usage of the community. And that could be broadly interpreted. Of course, they're talking about custom and usage in terms of how you secure consent. So, what format must consent be secured in. But it at least gives some kind of nod to the fact that these communities have a practice,
Mm.
IPILRA doesn't set out, these are the 5 steps you have to take to absolutely tick, 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 now you've got consent. It leaves space for how does a community itself, what practices it has for determining consent. And so I'm flagging that
Mm.
and
Mm.
saying that it's a rare thing, and I think it's a useful thing.
Mm. Like talking about land, it's such a, especially well in South Africa, not like I've like experienced land problems in anywhere else. It's such a complex conversation because we started talking about land reform and where we're at right
Yeah.
now. But while we're talking about that, we are still, talking about or forced to talk about protections against continued land dispossession, because the tools that you just mentioned right now are tools that people can use to protect themselves against land dispossession,
Mhm.
which again highlights this dichotomy that actually land dispossession is continuing while land reform is not happening. Mhlaba.
Yeah, I just have another quick question. Ipilra seems to be doing a very big and great job in protecting um, the lives of those in the former Bantu stans. But why is it temporary and not made permanent? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so IPILRA was enacted in 96. The idea was that it would, as the name suggests, be an interim measure until a more permanent law could come into place, as is required by Section 25(9) of the Constitution. It took the state longer than they anticipated to do that. And so we still sit with this supposed interim piece of law that's been in effect since 1996. I think in some ways that has probably been a blessing, because the versions of the more permanent, more comprehensive law, because the PILRA doesn't, for example, have regulations, right? It really was meant to be just kind of a place, a law to fill the gap. The benefit of that long-standing use of a PILRA has been the fact that we've seen attempts at passing this more permanent law in the form of the Communal Land Tenure Rights Act, so the CLRA. And that act was particularly problematic. In fact, it put at risk the rights of people who live within customary communities. And so it was struck down by the Constitutional Court on procedural grounds in the Tongwane case. And we still sit waiting for its replacement and for this kind of more permanent law. And in many ways, I think what certainly Lark's perspective is that in drafting that more permanent law, the state should be drawing a lot on IPILRA. It should be seeking to kind of use that as a starting point, build on it, strengthen it, but not depart from it. Because whatever permanent piece of legislation does come into place, it would replace IPILRA. And if that piece of legislation, moves in a way that kind of isn't aligned with IPILRA, then we would lose the protections that IPILRA provides for. And that, I would say, could be very detrimental to people.
Oh, wow. I mean, as we drawing to a close, we're really sorry to be posing all these questions to you because, again, I must acknowledge, or we do acknowledge that this is such a complex topic
Mm.
and reality that we're dealing with, and we're trying to unravel and understand where things are at. Because if you just, look out there and trying to assess what the situation is, it's not easy to get at a clear picture as to where is the land question right now. Is it being addressed? Is it being neglected? Do we just not care? or do we pretend to care? So thank you for giving us, a picture of what's going on. At least now we have some ideas, and I hope the viewers also have some idea of where things are at. And also, I'm struck by parallels in what you were saying about how currently, as a successful Black person, requires you to move away from yourself. It requires self harm, and how that is parallel to what you were saying about how the laws seems to be, clashing with customary law, except for Ipura. So I'm struck by those parallels, and I'm also struck by how they seem to be communicating continuities of colonial violence, because in the previous episode, we talked about what happened, when the infant Rebecca arrived and they started demarcating lands and planting the hedge in Kessenbosch, and then what that did to the freedom of the people who used to own this land, who used to live here. And I mean, the first, not the very first, but I mean, that was the very, so that's when the violence started. And it escalated to actually koi people and send people being handed down. And I mean, when we had Dr. Jacob, I think, if I recall very well here, his book goes deep into the violence that was perpetuated against those populations. And I remember reading about how San women were handed down and then their breasts were skinned and made into tobacco pouches. And then after that, we had a conversation with Umbuso Ngosi, who was telling us about a case in Bethal in Mpumalanga where prisoners were sent to work on that farm, were literally killed and buried in unmarked graves in the same farm that was used to plant potatoes. And this was not an isolated case. In his book, he also mentioned something similar in Dududu in KwaZulu-Natal. And in our conversation with Rev Mavuso and Nonle, they talked about how the current land dispossession often involves the digging of graves when people are being relocated and being moved. So I'm trying to link the metaphysical does matter because this experience is happening at that level as well. And what we're seeing, in the physical is a manifestation of that, because there seems to be this deeply entrenched violence that seems to continue. So I really like what we are saying about like how actually for you to be successful, to be seen as human, in the current context, you have to self-harm. For me, I'm seeing that as a continuation of that colonial violence. To an extent that actually I lately, and especially after this podcast, it got me to a point where I'm like, actually, I'm dropping the term colonialism. What we are experiencing, and actually if you define it in terms of Ubuntu, it's bubugqwirha, it's European evil, it's European witchcraft, because they're skinning people's breasts and digging people's graves and burying people in the farm where you plant food. Like how else do you explain that? And also what I think dropping that term for me is important because actually it's like this is the language that we're given also. It's colonialism. But then when you define it in terms of Isintu, you don't use colonialism, doesn't make sense in our languages. You colonialism and it doesn't communicate the violence that the term hides and subsumes under it. So I'm advocating for dropping it and just calling the process what it is, European evil that we are still experiencing as people, especially Black people in this country. Um, yeah, anyway, that's my wrap up from the episodes that we've had and the conversation we've had. But also, before I wrap up, sorry, here's one last question. You talked about, after my rant, you talked about creative methods that maybe we need to come up with in order to address the land question. In the current context of the GNU, do you see a possibility for that?
A part of me wants to be optimistic. Practically, Tiane, no. Because what the GNU needs to first do is develop a somewhat coherent and unified position on land. If you look at the spread of positions reflected, for example, in the election manifestos of the parties that make up the GNU, I must confess I'm not sure how they're going to do that. How they're going to, at the very first, develop a cohesive and coherent policy on land. Enough to then act on it, enough to then bring it to fruition. And one assumes, of course, that that coherent and cohesive position on land is one that really has the country's best interest at heart, right? So let's be gracious, let's assume that. They then have to act on that, which I think would be a mammoth task in and of itself, because you're kind of activating the mechanisms of the state, but you're activating the mechanisms based off the back of different ideas about what would work, right? And so, to be honest with you, it would probably take at least another 5-year term for them to maybe get to a point when they can begin to be thinking about creativity. Given what we've seen in terms of the pace at which the state and policy thought and legislative thought moves, I must admit, I think in this first term, if the GNU survives, I think we would maybe only be in a position to see something more creative from them in a second term. But yeah, I think that the task of trying to consolidate their position on land is so discordant at the moment and such a difficult task. I'm just not holding my breath for creativity.
Are you saying GNU is a regression?
I'm saying that the GNU is
Sorry for putting you on
no,
the spot.
no. I'm not saying that it's a regression, but I am saying that I don't know if it has enough substance to survive the robustness of the work that needs to be done, A, in developing a national position on land, and B, in really bringing about effective land reform. We're talking about robust work,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
This conversation, the
Yeah.
conversations of the podcast show us that what we're talking about here is a multifaceted, multi-leveled wound, a gaping wound in the nation's psyche. And to begin to address that and engage that and recognize that all means of addressing it are imperfect because we can never undo the original crime completely. That is robust work. That needs a state or a government arm with deep relationships of trust amongst themselves. It needs, people who are committed to servicing and healing a country. And with all due respect, I don't know that the GNU is that vehicle.
UMhlaba, thank you, Nolundi, for that response. And I think we're wrapping it here. UMhlaba, any last words?
Thank you, Nolundi.
Most welcome.
Yeah, that's all that I have to say. I wish we could have another episode on this because of the complexity of of land in South Africa. There is still much more to cover. But yeah, thank you for giving us all that you have for in this episode.
You're so right, uMhlaba. There's never enough time for these conversations, and we're
Absolutely.
not having them enough in all the platforms. I mean, we have so many radio stations, we have so many TV channels, and we're watching reality TV shows
Yeah.
that I shall not name. But when we have a stuck, important question that we should be addressing, and also you can tell that actually the question is neglected by the fact that actually it's public discourse is full of return the land, we want the land back. But actually, when you really listen to people, it's like there are no details of what this means or how people want the land to be returned. So I think not that I blame them, because as you were saying, the dispossession was multi-layered. And the fact that actually there's this public discourse on land that actually does not have the facts and details is actually a manifestation of that dispossession and how deeply ingrained it is.
Yes.
But for me, I think that directs us to what you said, your very last word of the GNU would need to do robust work. I think we all need to do robust work
Yes.
in asking questions, in having conversations, in speaking up,
And being proactive.
Yeah, robustly
Yes.
and honestly and bravely, because otherwise it would be another 30 years and we'll still be having these conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And on that point, now we're wrapping.
We're saying
The
goodbye.
conversation was good. I really enjoyed it.
Me too.
So, Nolundi, let's start with you. we're in our segment now where where you can highlight work, a person, a project, a community, or anything that you think is worth attention and spotlight.
Yeah, so I would like to spotlight the work of Dr. Dineo Kosana, who's currently based at SWAP at the University of Witwatersrand. She has written a book which is coming out next year. I have the pleasure of reviewing that book now. I would really encourage people to keep an eye out for when that book drops. It speaks to a lot of these themes.
Yeah.
A large part of the book is about this question of the relocation and disturbance of graves when people are being moved. So please, please watch this space. Follow her on the socials, Dr. Dineos Kosana, and I think her book is going to contribute a lot to this conversation.
Wow, that's
Mm.
awesome.
That's great. I love
Yeah.
that. And I mean, it links very well with a lot of books that we've highlighted here, and which I think are very, very important because I think, in addition to Mboso Ngosi's work on what happened in the farms, the people were killed and buried in unmarked graves, another book that adds to that story is Uhuru Palafala's book, Mine, Mine, Mine. I've mentioned it before, but I think it captures the continuity of the violence in how she unpacks what mining has done to the Black family. And I love how she talks about how actually mining is not just mining of land, it's actually mining of Black women's wombs, because it's the young men who are born by Black women who form the labor that digs the mines, the gold, the minerals, and all of that. And actually, in essence, they're mining Black women's wombs, and all they get back is just they get nothing actually back, and they get people who come back home sick or passed away. And so I think I really like there's a cohort of academics who are digging deeper into these questions, and I think we are in an interesting time. And my highlight, I really don't want to finish this episode. It's clear. I'm going to be highlighting this report. It's called the uMhlaba Trust Financial Reporting Implications for Accountability. And just to read quickly, the report examines the record of changes in the financial reporting, the board's argument for these changes, and the difficulties that those in legally mandated structures have had in obtaining the information necessary for proper oversight. So this should make for an interesting read or informative read. uMhlaba Trust Board report.
Awesome.
And on that note, thank you very much for your time and for watching us. And we hope you enjoyed our conversation. And actually, I think this is the last episode of the series. So I would really like to thank my colleagues that have been holding the space with me. To start with, Tando Kupane, Wandile Zondo, Kyle Jansen, and of course, the people who have taken on the role of uMhlaba, from Nokwanda Sihlali to Ncedo Mngabisa and Katleho Ramonsi Mane.
Yes.
Yes. Those are some of my colleagues, and of course, my guests.
Aisha.
And Aisha Mutala. Oh.
Yeah.
And of course, the guests that have graced us with their presence, Nolundi, Nombonso Gasa, Nonhle, Mbutuma, and others, because now memory is going. And also would like to say thank you to One Button Studios for hosting us and operating the cameras for us and help us, know how to, I don't know,
Share the knowledge.
share the knowledge in a
Yes.
studio. Nerve-wracking, but we did it.
We did.
So thank you. We're done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nolundi.
Pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's amazing.
Thank you.